Have you ever wondered what it feels like to step back onto your homeland after 5 long years that would forever change not only your life, but the way humanity sees itself? On October 2nd, 1836, Charles Darwin returned to England after his legendary voyage on HMS Beagle. What he carried back with him wasn't just seashells, plant specimens, and notebooks full of scribbles. It was the seed of an idea so radical it would eventually shake the foundations of science, religion, and our understanding of life itself. Today we're diving deep into this pivotal moment in history. Why was this homecoming so significant? What had Darwin seen on his travels? And how did those 5 years abroad transform a young, somewhat uncertain naturalist into the man who would write on the origin of species? Picture England in 1836. It's the dawn of the Victorian era. Steam engines puff across the countryside. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. But the world of biology is still rooted in traditional, almost biblical explanations of life. Species, people believed, were fixed. God had created them exactly as they were. Into this world steps Charles Darwin, 27 years old, exhausted but brimming with energy and ideas. On October 2nd, HMS Beagle finally anchors in Falmouth, Cornwall. The voyage had lasted just under 5 years, far longer than the originally planned 2. Darwin writes to his family with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, "I am quite bewildered with the hurry and excitement of arriving in England." Imagine the relief, after endless storms, tropical diseases, seasickness, and months of isolation, to finally see the green hills of home again. But Darwin didn't return as the same man who had left. He had departed as a curious but inexperienced naturalist. He came back as someone who had seen the vast diversity of life with his own eyes, who had walked among fossils of giant sloths in South America, marveled at coral reefs in the Pacific, and, most famously, studied finches and tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. The young man who stepped off the Beagle was no longer just an observer. He was becoming a revolutionary thinker. So what exactly did Darwin bring home with him? First, there were the specimens. Over 1,500 jars of preserved animals and plants, dozens of fossils, rocks, and minerals. In fact, so many samples that had to send shipments back to England while still on the voyage. Second, there were the notebooks. Darwin had been meticulous, writing down observations in extraordinary detail. From geology to zoology, from weather patterns to native customs, nothing escaped his pen. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Darwin returned with questions. Why did species vary from island to island? Why did extinct creatures resemble living ones in the same region? Why did some animals seem perfectly adapted to their environment, as though shaped by invisible hands? Darwin didn't yet have the answers, but he had gathered the raw material for a theory that would eventually explain them all. It's easy to focus on the science, but let's pause for a moment and think about Darwin, the person. He was only 22 when he left England, essentially still a student. He came back nearly 28, a man shaped by hardship and discovery. He had survived dangerous encounters in South America, near shipwrecks, illnesses that plagued him for years afterward, and endless months of cramped living conditions aboard the Beagle. Returning home wasn't just a scientific milestone, it was deeply emotional. He rushed to embrace his family. He reconnected with friends. He reunited with mentors like John Stevens Henslow, who had recommended him for the Beagle voyage in the first place. And yet Darwin's return was not one of triumphant fanfare. He was still relatively unknown, still piecing together his ideas. Nobody could have predicted on that October day that this quiet young man would one day write one of the most important books in the history of science. Let's zoom in on the scientific importance of Darwin's return. During the voyage, Darwin had made countless observations that hinted at something bigger, that species weren't fixed. On the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that finches differed from island to island, each with beaks seemingly suited to their specific diets. On mainland South America, he saw fossils of extinct creatures that closely resembled species still living nearby. These patterns gnawed at him. They didn't fit with the idea of static, God-given species. Instead, they suggested change, transformation, evolution. Of course, Darwin didn't yet have the full theory. That would take over 20 years of reflection, writing, and gathering evidence. But October 2nd, 1836 marks the turning point. From that moment on, Darwin would dedicate his life to solving the puzzle. As he later wrote, reflecting on the voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career. So what happened next? Darwin quickly set to work, collaborating with other scientists. The specimens he had collected were examined by experts in London. Botanists, geologists, and zoologists marveled at the treasures he had brought back. His reputation began to grow. He also began publishing his findings. His geological observations, his studies of coral reefs, his writings on South American wildlife, all these works helped establish him as a respected naturalist. Behind the scenes, however, Darwin was quietly developing his revolutionary idea of natural selection. But he knew it was controversial. He knew it would challenge religion, philosophy, and the very way people saw themselves. So he held back. He kept refining, questioning, building evidence, until 1859, more than 20 years later, when he finally released On the Origin of Species. But remember, none of that would have been possible without October 2nd, 1836, the day he set foot back on English soil with the pieces of the great puzzle. Why does Darwin's return still matter? Because it reminds us that big ideas are born not in sudden flashes of genius, but in long, difficult journeys of observation, questioning, and persistence. Darwin didn't come home with a finished theory. He came home with curiosity. And that curiosity, pursued relentlessly, changed the world. It's also a reminder of the courage required to challenge accepted wisdom. In Darwin's time, the idea that species could change or that humans might share common ancestry with other animals was almost unthinkable. And yet one man's willingness to question what he saw laid the groundwork for modern biology, genetics, and medicine. October 2nd, 1836 was more than just a homecoming. It was the beginning of a scientific revolution. So next time you think about Charles Darwin, don't just picture the bearded sage writing in his study. Picture the young man stepping off the Beagle in Falmouth Harbor, heart pounding with excitement, mind buzzing with questions. That day, October 2nd, 1836, was the moment the world began to change, even if nobody realized it yet. Thanks for joining me on this journey back in time. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with fellow history and science enthusiasts. And let me leave you with one final thought. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas don't begin with answers, they begin with questions.